hold back. The many little imperialists have been consolidated under an American umbrella. It is a degenerate form of capitalism that is totally dominated by finance capital. Finance capital finally won its long internal battle with manufacturing capital, or sometimes called productive capital. Finance capital overwhelmed industrial capital and ate it up and then exported it to the former colonies, or the current colonies, the third world, the now developing world. Finance capital methodically dismantled most of the domestic industrial infrastructure because it didn't provide a high enough rate of return on investment. Capitalism is not about development of societies except as a byproduct of gouging ever-increasing rates of return. Excuse me. Finance capital has no interest in anything except reproducing itself, finance creating more finance. When it could not generate ever more fantastic rates of return through the old ways of banking, finance capital gave birth to the mutant money that we call derivatives, which slosh around in the world to the tune of hundreds of trillions of so-called dollars. The very existence of $500 or $600 trillion in derivatives is proof positive that capitalism has already collapsed. It cannot achieve the rates of return that it must have in order to survive. So it creates phony money, those derivatives, with nominal values that are 10 or 12 times greater than the actual economy of the world. It is totally disconnected from the actual economy of the world. So we see that capitalism at this stage is a shell and a sham and a farce of false values. It is paper wealth. And this last stage of capitalism, imperialism, is reduced finally to only the military might of the United States, which spends more money on weapons than all of the rest of the world combined. In the end, at the end of this historical game, and we're coming to the end, there is no soft power anymore. You've heard that term, especially in connection with Barack Obama. Now there is only hard power, that is brute force. Barack Obama is there to give the illusion of soft power, to establish a false scenario of reasonableness and diplomacy and civilized behavior. But it's all play acting. Obama spends more money on war than Bush did. He's greatly expanded the scope of U.S. aggression in the world in his brief time in office. U.S. Special Forces now operate in 75 countries around the globe. The AFPAC, Afghanistan-Pakistan Theater of War, now effectively includes Yemen and Somalia. And U.S. preparations for war against Iran are now at roughly the same stage as U.S. preparations for war with Iraq were in the summer of 2002, the summer before the invasion of Iraq. Just last week, the Obama White House released a statement saying that Israel has every right to maintain its security by any means that it sees fit, and this was in direct reference to Israel's nuclear arsenal. This was a direct reference. It was a statement that screamed to the world that Obama not only has no problem with a nuclear Israel, but that Israel is free to use its nuclear weapons as it deems necessary. This effectively constitutes a U.S.-Israeli nuclear threat against Iran, and it was intended to be seen as such. So much for soft power. Imperialism doesn't have any soft power anymore. It's down to the bare knuckles at this stage of the game. Finance capital exported its soft power, its former industrial might, to the old colonies to get a higher rate of return, and it doesn't have that anymore. In so doing, it transferred producing power to the developing world, to the South and to the East, and it can't get that back. It wouldn't know what to do with it because that doesn't pay a high enough rate of return. And here we see, I believe, the great poetry of history and political economy. In the 19th century, capitalism saved itself by exporting its deadly contradictions to the colonized world, where it could maintain ever-increasing rates of return through super-exploitation. Industrial capitalism bought itself more time in the 19th century through the advent of imperialism, and it was at the rest of humanity's expense. In the late 20th century, finance capital reigned supreme in the West. Wall Street then devoured the industrial base of the world's largest economy, this one, and exported much of that base. Inevitably, the center of gravity of economic power shifted. All the capitalists now had left was capital and derivatives and guns. And they also have Barack Obama, whose purpose is to fool people into not recognizing that the U.S. imperialist machine is in the midst of an offensive to pick up where George Bush stumbled in Iraq. Finance capital, which rules in Washington and in Europe, cannot reverse its quickening disintegration by any means other than by military means. It is unraveling as dictated by its own DNA. It must, I repeat, it must establish military domination over energy sources wherever possible in the world. That is not for the purpose of guaranteeing energy supplies to the home countries, to England and the United States and France. That's not it. First of all, because no energy producing country wants to cut off energy to any of their customers. Second, finance capitalists have no home country because they are only loyal to their class. The U.S. seeks control over energy producing regions in order to hold them hostage as a strategic threat to the rest of the world, especially those emerging countries of the South and the East, and most especially China. This is the prop, the walking cane, that imperialism desperately needs if it's going to stay in the game at all at this late stage. Imperialism can no longer compete, it can only coerce. Latin America is in good shape to deal with these last spasms of imperial death. The U.S. can't return there as a bully. The people of that hemisphere have wised up to the United States, and they don't have a problem with saying so. But Africa is a different story. U.S. penetration and militarization of Africa is very far advanced. Some of us get great satisfaction from the fact that the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, doesn't yet have a formal headquarters in an African host country. But the truth is, they don't need one. AFRICOM already has an effective headquarters in Djibouti, which borders on Somalia and Eritrea. U.S. Special Forces range from Djibouti all over the Horn of Africa and all up and down the Sahel. The penetration is deeper than that. About 30 African militaries now use American command and control equipment. They are trained by American military advisors. And last year, those 30 militaries conducted joint exercises with the Americans, who were careful to forge one-on-one, soldier-to-soldier relationships with the African officer corps. The aim is to make them a Trojan horse for the United States in Africa. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus may be very proud of themselves whenever U.S. so-called aid is funneled to Africa, but almost all of U.S. Africa programs are now administered through the U.S. military command. AFRICOM is rapidly militarizing Africa under U.S. direction. And that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they have a formal headquarters in a host country. Even steps that appear to represent progress towards African unity may be, if we look a little closer, something else entirely. The newly expanded East African community may seem to be a step towards a regional African common market, but the new configuration, which is Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, plus Rwanda and Burundi, looks a lot like a pro-U.S. imperialism bloc in Africa. Rwanda and Uganda are the Americans' military client states on the continent, and Rwandan troops under cover as African Union peacekeepers are America's mercenary force in Somalia. So imperialism needs to seize control of a resource-rich prize in order to keep alive. And that prize looks to be Africa, a seizure that is currently presided over by the FBP, the first black president. Thanks.
Uhuru. Thank Brother Glenn for that presentation, very informative, etc. Those things that's going on in Africa will continue until it engages African internationalism. Next speaker on the question of imperialist crisis and Obama's war is our own chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru.
Uhuru. First of all, I want to express my appreciation to Comrade Glenn Ford for that presentation. I thought it was extraordinarily significant presentation. And I also think that one of the things that makes it important is that what the presentation has done, hopefully, is to help us to understand that the issue that we confronted when we look at when we look at specifically at the phenomenon of Barack Hussein Obama getting elected President of the United States is not some domestic, local issue that we're confronted with. I saw one argument that was posed against the African People's Socialist Party by some organization that characterized itself as some leftist or socialist or communist organization, that we were wrong in assuming that Obama was a response to a crisis of imperialism because there is no situation occurring in the United States right now that would demand imperialism to try and deal with that crisis by giving us a Barack Obama. That is a really local and narrow understanding of what imperialism is and what the significance of U.S. imperialism is in the world. Because the question, even though it is important, Barack Obama has tremendous significance for revolutionary struggle inside this country because the crisis of imperialism growing rapidly to such an extent that people who are lost their homes to Obama's chairwoman's Pritzker's scheme of subprime mortgage and foreclosures, tremendous amounts of wealth being lost there, to increasing police violence, militarization of African communities here inside this country in our communities, to what is happening to our children in the school systems, that Barack Obama is absolutely necessary even in this country.